What's up, guys? Welcome to another video. Today is going to be all about running myths. I'm going to go over 10 of them that still circulate internet land, and some of them are actually pretty important to cover. Other ones are a little bit more semantics, but can act as litmus tests to determine whether the person giving you running advice knows what they're talking about or not so much. So we're going to go over all 10. I'm going to explain why they're myths, as well as what you can do about it and what to consider when implementing your own run training to make it more applicable to your goals. So let's hop right into it. The first one is lactic acid. There are kind of two myths that still circulate somehow across the internet with lactic acid. One of them is lactic acid is the reason that you feel fatigue when you're doing higher intensity training, like you're doing a mile time trial or 2 mile time trial, whatever it is. People will think that lactic acid is causing that burning sensation, that fatigue, and it is restricting your progress or restricting your ability to go faster or maintain that pace for as long as you want to maintain that pace. Another lactic acid myth is some people will think that it is the reason that you're sore the next day. It is the main thing that causes DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness, and neither of those are true. So this myth has been debunked a while ago, but I will kind of get into what is occurring and the differences between lactic acid, lactate, as well as what's causing that fatigue and what's causing that burning sensation. First of all, delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS, the soreness that you feel after a training session, the day after, 2 days after, has nothing to do with lactic acid. It is mostly muscle damage, inflammation, and just the natural breakdown of muscle tissue that occurs when you either run or do strength training or whatever else causes soreness. So that one is not quite as commonly touted these days, but just getting that one out of the way. The one that still continues to be discussed and be considered a reason that you are struggling with your higher intensity runs is that lactic acid is causing that fatigue. And what's actually occurring is when you do glycolytic training, so you are using carbohydrates, whether in the form of glucose, which is circulating your bloodstream, or glycogen that's stored in your musculature, you're breaking that down and using that for fuel. And in that process, lactate is produced. Lactate is not the same as lactic acid. Lactate is a fuel source that the more fit you are, the better you are at using lactate, and the longer you can maintain higher paces, faster paces, higher efforts. There's something called a lactate threshold, where the higher you get that, the closer that is to your VO2 max, the longer you can sustain it and the faster you can go and the harder you can go. So the fitter you are, the better your lactate threshold is. So that's the lactate part. Acidity also occurs during this glycolytic process. However, it is not because of the lactate. It's completely separate. So the acidity occurs as a result of hydrogen ion accumulation in the muscle cells. So what that does is lowers the pH inside the cell. And if you think back to, I don't know, maybe elementary school, when you have a lower pH, it becomes more acidic. And so that is the reason that you're feeling this fatigue, this burning sensation, among other things. But none of those are lactic acid. Lactic acid is a completely different thing. In fact, if you were suffering from lactic acid buildup in your musculature, you should go to the hospital immediately, because you are likely suffering from lactic acidosis, which can be life-threatening if not treated immediately. And that has nothing to do with what happens when you train too hard. You're not going to get lactic acidosis from training too hard. It's a completely different medical phenomenon. So although this one is not really make or break, it's not going to make you a great runner or not a great runner, whether you know it or not, it is still something that you can use as a litmus test to determine whether the person that you're getting running information from knows what they're talking about or really doesn't. There are some old school coaches that probably know the difference between lactic acid, lactate, and all these different mechanisms that still use lactic acid, just because it's well understood amongst lots of people who are listening to their info. But still, I think it's just doing people a disservice calling that, even if you do know better. I think it's a little bit disingenuous to use that term. So that's number one. Let's go into number two, which is a lot more applicable to run gains or not run gains. And that is the 80-20 rule. So this rule originated as a result of a study, a scientist who took a look at a large group of endurance trainees and differentiated their lower intensity training, their zone 1, zone 2 training in a 5-zone model between their zone 4, zone 5 training, or their higher intensity training. And on average in that group, it was about 80-20, 80% lower intensity, 20% higher intensity. However, again, these people were strictly endurance athletes. So all they cared about was improving their endurance. They did not care about getting strong. They did not care about going to the gym and building muscle. They didn't care about any other form of conditioning. They were dead set on just getting good at running, which you should be if you're a high level endurance athlete. However, this was extrapolated and taken out of context and became a blanket rule for pretty much everyone. Like everyone's training should be 80-20, regardless of what your goals are, how much you're running, how little you're running. And that's not the case. If you have followed some of my programs, and I've actually had people DM me and ask why the ratio of higher intensity to lower intensity work is not 80-20. And it's because it doesn't really apply to people who are training for multiple different things and or aren't running very, very high volumes. If you're a higher level runner and that's all you care about, your training is probably going to be 85-15, maybe even 90-10. Some guys are even higher than 90-10, like very, very little higher intensity, lots and lots of lower intensity, depending on the part of the season. Of course, there's, the off season, there's the support phase, there's the base phase, there's the actual specificity race prep phase. But sometimes that ratio is even much lower than 80-20. However, if you are someone who is trying to get the most out of your running that you possibly can on a lower running volume, a lower weekly running volume, doing 80% of that work at a low intensity, unless you are kind of in a base phase, then maybe it might even be higher than 80%. But talking about actual run progress, like you're actually trying to get better at a 2 mile or a 5 mile or a 10K, whatever it is, then you're probably leaving some gains on the table by only doing 20% of your work at a higher intensity. So although this could potentially be appropriate for you, it is not that simple. Some people are going to be closer to 70-30, some people even 60-40, maybe even 50-50. And like I said, if you're building a base, doing mostly easy running, maybe occasional sprints and strides, then it's probably going to be like 95-5. So just using this as a blanket rule and thinking like, no matter what, I have to do 80% low intensity, regardless of whether I'm running 15 miles a week or 75 miles a week, is not going to benefit you very well. So if your program has a little bit more than 20% higher intensity stuff and a little bit less than 80% lower intensity stuff, and also your program is not just a running program and or isn't super high volume running program, then don't worry about it. You're probably going to be okay. Quality over quantity. And I'll get into another one later about mileage that will discuss this even further. So number 3, this is a lifting one, and it is you should lift for higher reps and lower weight. So muscle endurance style lifting. And this one's actually kind of counterintuitive. Like you would think in order to improve your muscular endurance for running, you should probably do higher reps. Also, it's a little bit less seemingly fatiguing to put less weight on the bar and do more reps and really work on that, like getting to that burn and that pump and just doing rep after rep. However, what happens when you do this is it is not specific. So to improve your muscular endurance in your legs for running, you need to run. That is the best way to do it. Of course, there's carryover from other styles of training, but just look at Lance Armstrong. Lance Armstrong was the greatest biker of all time. I know he did PEDs. We are going to completely disregard that, but he was the best biker of all time, 7 Tour de France's. When he stopped biking and ran his first marathon, he finished about an hour slower than the winner. So one of the best endurance athletes in the world, but guess what? He built all that endurance on the bike, and the specificity did not carry over to running. He ran about a 3-hour marathon, which is very good. A lot of people dream of running that fast, but it's nowhere near elite. And again, he finished an hour slower. So that should show you a little bit about the specificity component. He had great muscle endurance for biking, but not so much for running. And although that's one of a few factors, that is definitely one of them. However, when you are doing higher reps, especially if you're going close to failure, which is required in order for you to make gains, it's more fatiguing. So if you don't believe me, next week, go do 3 sets of 5 with 1 rep in reserve on a hack squat. The following week, go and do 3 sets of 20 with 1 rep in reserve on a hack squat. Let me know which one you recover better from. If you are actually going that hard to 1 rep in the tank, you're going to be way more destroyed from 3 sets to 20 than you are from 3 sets of 5, even though that 3 sets of 5 is higher weight. When you're doing your strength training for running improvements, most people strength train for running to improve their durability as well as maybe their ability to run up hills and hit those higher efforts and those higher speeds, higher gears. Your strength training should be focused on strength, building strength. And you build strength best in the probably 3 to 8 rep range for most runners. And also what that does is it's much less fatiguing. It takes less time. It interferes less with your running and it builds strength. And you can use your running specific training to build leg muscle endurance for running because again, it has to be specific. So If you want to be super fatigued and feel like you're doing maybe something right, but really suffer with your run training and not really see much better muscle endurance in your actual running, then go ahead and turn your lifts into cardio and do super high reps, short rest periods, lots and lots of volume. If you want to actually support your running and improve, keep those rep ranges lower, rest a long time between sets. The less your lifting looks like cardio or resembles cardio, the better, and you're going to be a lot better off. Which brings us to number 4, which is one of my favorites. Vegan or plant-based eating is the best way for runners to eat. Now, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I think this probably originated because most people are aware that carbohydrates are a very important fuel source for running improvement, especially endurance running. And because most animal products aren't very high in carbohydrates, and most plant products and non-animal products are higher in carbohydrate, I believe it was just kind of magnified. And we're like, oh, carbs are good. Not a lot of carbs in animal products, so that must mean we should just eat plant products. And although you can absolutely make that work, it's a lot more effort requiring, and it requires you to do a lot of research. It requires lots and lots of supplementation, and very specific supplementation based on what nutrient deficiencies you're going to have because you're not eating animal products. It also requires very frequent lab work and making sure that you're not destroying your health. And honestly, most people, whether they eat vegan or not, are not willing to do all those things. And they miss things. They miss supplementation. They don't get their lab work done often enough. They don't actually monitor their health the way they should. Luckily, though, if you eat meat or animal products at least, whether it's meat or not, but ideally meat and other animal products like milk and eggs, you don't really have to monitor yourself quite as much. It's still beneficial for sure. Certain supplementation can help a lot of people. Getting lab work done very frequently is probably a good idea, but it's not quite as potentially detrimental if you don't do those things, but you're eating plenty of meat. The nutrient density, the protein quality, the bioavailability of the protein in animal products is way better than vegan-based protein sources. Most vegan-based protein sources are either a carbohydrate with a little bit of protein in it or fat with a little bit of protein in it. There are some that are higher percentage proteins, but overall across the board, you're getting lower quality protein. You're going to have to eat more protein. You're going to have to potentially contend with trying to get enough protein, but also not in a way that puts you over your calorie intake. Because again, like most of these sources are not pure protein. So if you want to perform best and you want to be as healthy as you possibly can, and you also want to reduce your chances of getting some sort of nutrient deficiency that can directly affect your running, like very, very common in runners, even sometimes runners that eat meat, let alone don't eat meat, then I would highly suggest not going vegan, unless of course it's some sort of moral thing, but just keep in mind that you're going to have to do all that extra work. You're going to have to do all that extra supplementation that you could just not do if you just ate some meat or other animal products. So that one is false. Can it work? Yes. But is it the best idea? Not necessarily. Which brings us to myth number 5, which is the 10% rule. And this rule usually states that you should increase your running volume by 10% per week. And that can work, but it does not scale very well. If you are in the, I would say 12-ish to 30-ish miles per week range, the 10% rule works pretty well. If you're lower than 10 miles or higher than probably 35, 40 miles, this rule does not scale well. For example, if you ran 6 miles, say you're starting a base phase and you ran 6 miles this week. Next week, you'd run 6.6 using the 10% rule. The following week, you would run 7.3 or 7.4. The following week, maybe get up to 8. It would take you about 6 weeks just to get up to 10 miles using this 10% rule, which is very, very too conservative, honestly. And you could add more volume than that per week and be totally fine. A lot more, not necessarily. You want to be a little bit more on the conservative side, but 10%, it would take you 6 weeks to just to get to 10 miles. Also, if you're running, say, 50 miles a week and you use the 10% rule, next week you're running 55. The following week, you're running 60 and a half. The following week, you're running 67, 68. It's like an 18-mile increase in just a couple weeks. So you can see how this rule just becomes a little bit outrageous. Now, what is the right way to do it? It depends on what your goals are. It depends on what phase of running you're in. Are you in a base phase? Are you in a maintenance phase? Are you in a support phase? Are you in a run prep or race prep or selection prep phase? There's way too much nuance to give a blanket rule. So again, if you are kind of working your way up and you're in that 10 to 35 mile per week range, you probably could use the 10% rule for a while, but just know that once you get higher than that, or if you haven't got there yet, it's not going to scale well, and you can probably add a little bit more if you're in the lower end, and I would probably add a little bit less, fewer miles, and even consider repeat miles. So maybe you get up to 50 miles a week, maybe you run that for a few weeks straight and let your body adapt to it. Then maybe you add a couple miles, and so on and so forth, depending on what you're going for, depending on what your mileage goal is. So 10% rule, although it can apply, it's not my favorite, and there's a lot more nuance to it than just giving someone a blanket rule like that. Let's hop into number 5, which is do not heel strike. Heel striking will automatically lead to spontaneous combustion and instant death. So, of course, I exaggerate there, but what if I told you that some of the best runners of all time are heel strikers or were heel strikers? Do you think I'd be lying? Well, I'm not lying. That is the case. There's a big difference between types of heel strikes and the things that occur as a result of different types of heel strikes. So the common newbie runner heel strike is usually a result of low cadence, very, very low cadence. So they're overstriding and their foot's landing way out in front of their midline. And it's essentially just acting as a little brake that you have to overcome every single time. It's almost like you're driving down the highway going 60 and you put the brake on. You just kind of ride the brake the entire time. So you're making yourself a whole lot less efficient. And with running, unlike driving a car, well, actually, it's probably not very good for the car either. But with running, it is a lot more impactful too. So you're hitting the ground a lot harder. You're sending higher impact forces through your body. And therefore, you're going slower, you're working harder, and you're also increasing your injury risk. If you are heel striking as a result of overstriding in very low cadence, it's called a braking heel strike, aptly named. A grazing heel strike, however, is totally different. There's a bunch of different names for it. I call it a grazing heel strike. Essentially, the only thing in common with a braking heel strike and a grazing heel strike is that your heel hits the ground first. But it's hitting the ground under your midline because you're not overstriding. You have a higher cadence, most likely, and it's not disrupting your forward movement, and it's not adding impact to every run stride. So that is the type of heel strike that the high-level runners that you see heel striking have. And clearly they're high-level runners. They don't get injured all the time. It has nothing to do with whether their heel's touching the ground first or not. The issue with really focusing on not heel striking is most people try and overcompensate, or they overcorrect and they start doing tiptoe running, which can be very, very stressful on the Achilles, the soleus, and it's also a very inefficient way to run. It takes more energy and you're going to be slower. So although you're hitting the ground on your toes, lots of downsides to that. When you simply focus on, this is for most people, not everyone, it's not a solve all, but it's a solve lots of things. When you focus on your cadence and increasing your cadence compared to where you're at right now, there's no perfect cadence. You'll hear 180. I almost put this in there as a myth. The 180 cadence is perfect for everyone. Not necessarily, but you should be somewhere close to 180, plus or minus. If you're a little shorter, your cadence might be a little higher. If you're a little taller, your cadence might be a little lower. But either way, you can improve your cadence from where it's at right now. And that's really the best way to do it, is slowly but surely increase your cadence over runs. Now, if you have to bring your cadence up significantly, say your cadence is 145 right now, which is not unheard of, and you want to get it up to 170, 175, you should not try and get it up to 175 in 3 or 4 runs. It should be a very, very, very gradual progression. A couple steps per minute per run is a pretty good spot, and it's not going to be linear. Some runs you're going to kind of stagnate. Some runs it may be 3 or 4. Some runs it might be 1. You don't have to be perfectly wrapped around the numbers with that. But simply increasing your cadence will inherently make your strides a little shorter, and it will inherently over time make it so that you're not landing way out in front of you and putting that brake on and smashing your heel into the ground, and therefore increasing your injury risk, and therefore increasing how hard it is for you to maintain certain paces. So if you are heel striking in a grazing manner, totally fine. If you're heel striking in a big, strong braking manner, then something you want to consider. And the best way to do that is bring your cadence up. Which brings us to myth number 7, which is you have to use heart rate for zone 2. And although heart rate can be a great proxy for zone 2, it is just a proxy. It's not an indicator. For example, I could go sit in the sauna and have a panic attack, and I'd probably be in zone 2. If I was just going off heart rate, it would probably bring my heart rate up into that 130, 140 range, maybe even higher for some people. That doesn't mean I'm getting good zone 2 aerobic adaptations. That just means my heart rate is up from something other than physical activity, which is very, very doable. If I chugged a 300 milligram caffeine Bang energy drink right now, my heart rate would probably increase without me doing anything at all. So there are lots of different factors that can go into heart rate on a given day. Some days you might notice that you're running at about the same effort as you usually do, and your heart rate may be higher. Or on the flip side, maybe it's lower, but you're still running around that same effort. That's very common. And if you're just using heart rate, then some days you're going to run a little too easy. Some days you're going to run a little too hard. Whereas if you become more in tune with your body, learn what an RPE scale looks and feels like, most easy runs should be an RPE of 4 to 5. Most zone 2 longer runs, maybe 5 to 6, just because of the other factors that cause fatigue later in a run. If you can learn that, and you don't have goals to be an elite high-level runner, even I would argue it's still important to learn RPE if you do have those goals, but you're probably not if you're watching this, then you're going to be good to go. And that's just for zone 2. You can learn what RPE 7.5, 8 feels like for higher intensity stuff, 9 or 10 for sprints, and so on and so forth. But we're just talking zone 2 here. So heart rate is just one proxy. It should not be the only proxy you use. It can be one of them, but you also want to use another proxy, whether it's RPE, the ability to say a 12-ish word sentence without having to stop for a breath or really having to recover your breath afterwards. The ability to nasal breathe, that one's a little bit less applicable just because you can get really good at nasal breathing in higher zones than zone 2, but it could be a good one to start out with. And just know that sometimes your heart rate's going to be a little higher, despite the fact that you're still going at the right intensity. Sometimes it might be a little bit lower, and you can either speed up or kind of just accept it. But heart rate is just not the only way to do it. And it's honestly, for most people, probably not even the best way in my experience. So next myth is also along the lines of zone 2, and that is your zone 2 pace matters, or your zone 2 pace will reflect what your faster running ability will look like. And both of those are wrong. Zone 2 pace doesn't matter that much if you are ashamed of your zone 2 pace, so therefore you just run in zone 3 or 4 just because you like what you see on your watch better. You're only doing yourself a disservice. What matters most is your race paces. You are probably not training for a zone 2 pace competition. If you are, it is the first one I've ever heard of. It'll be the inaugural zone 2 pace competition, and it doesn't really sound like a very fun thing to train for. What you are actually doing zone 2 for is systemic adaptations, aerobic adaptations. You're not necessarily running for pace adaptations. It doesn't really reflect your potential ability to run a certain 5-mile time or a certain 2-mile time or a certain half marathon time. There are lots of different high-level runners that run very similar race paces, but their zone 2 paces and also their zone 2 heart rate, going back to the last one, are all different. And if it was a good proxy, the people who run about the same pace in, say, a marathon or a half marathon would also run about the same pace in their zone 2. And that just is not the case. There are many people who are kind of newer runners. Maybe they got into base building a little late, so they had maybe built a little bit of speed before they actually got into the base building part. And if that's you, you may notice that your race paces are pretty fast and your zone 2 paces are pretty terrible. Very slow. I shouldn't say terrible, but just slow. Maybe you're running a 11:30, 12-minute per mile pace in zone 2, and you're running a 37-minute 5-mile. Usually that wouldn't compute. However, I've seen it happen many times. Additionally, your zone 2 pace, kind of like your heart rate, is always going to fluctuate. Some days you're going to be well rested, well recovered, primed to perform, and you're going to be able to run faster at that same intensity. Other days you're going to be a little bit more fatigued, sore, or maybe just under recovered, and you're going to be running a little slower at that pace. That's just the nature of it. That is how it works. So don't get too wrapped around the axle with zone 2 pace. Which brings us to number 9, which is the difference between sprints and repeats and or intervals for endurance. All right, so I'm going to call them repeats and sprints, 2 different categories. So I'll hear people say like, oh yeah, I ran my 800-meter sprints. I've been doing sprints every week to get faster at the 2-mile or the 5-mile. And I run 400s, 800s sprints. And although this seems like semantics, the mindset is a little different. Sprints, when you think sprints, you want to think short, very, very hard, almost max effort or max effort, and lots of time in between each one. Sprints make you faster. They develop your fast twitch muscle fibers. They incorporate the ATP PC energy system, which is the energy system that is responsible for strength, power, very, very quick duration, very low endurance. And they can be beneficial for sure for endurance athletes. When you think repeats, you are thinking about developing anaerobic and or aerobic capacity. So you are going a little longer, a little bit slower, lower effort, so you can repeat them. And you are usually going to rest incomplete. So when you think sprints, think I want to get faster at sprinting and or I want to develop my running musculature, my leg running musculature, specifically fast twitch. And I don't want it to feel much like cardio. It should feel like a really, really hard sprint, and then you should take plenty of time in between each round to recover so that you can go repeat that effort. If you're doing, say, a 20-second sprint with 20 seconds rest, how many times do you think you're going to be able to repeat that first 20-second sprint with that really short rest period? Not very many. Professional sprinters, the fastest people on earth, they rest like 8 to 12 minutes between a set of an 80-meter sprint. You don't have to do that as an endurance runner, but that should give you an idea of what sprints will kind of look like. Repeats, again, are longer. They include incomplete rest, and they are more endurance focused. So you're not going all out every time you do a 400 or an 800. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to repeat it. Additionally, you can mess with the rest period. So you can do like faster, more aerobic power style repeats where you go at a higher intensity and rest longer in between each one. Or you could do more race pace stuff where you go a little easier at a maintainable race pace and rest a little bit shorter in between. So you're not getting complete rest. You're starting the next one with your heart rate elevated. You're a little bit out of breath still. And that can be a great way to build your overall capacity, your lactate threshold, your VO2 max, and so on and so forth. So sprints, repeats, totally different things. There are benefits to both for endurance runners, but running 400-meter sprints, 800-meter sprints, it's not a sprint. It is a repeat session. And even if you are going all out on a 400 or an 800, technically that's not a sprint. So let's get into the last one, and that is mileage over everything. You'll hear a lot of people say, oh, you're not making run progress, you should just increase your mileage, without really adding any context. And although this can absolutely work, your running can benefit from increased mileage, it is just one of many levers that you can pull. For example, most high-level, we'll say ultra runners, probably run upwards of 100, 120. Some guys are even up in the 140, 150 miles per week range, which is crazy. It's very high, but that's their sport. And they run 100-mile races, so they need high run volume. But not all of them. This year, David Roche, who won the Leadville 100, which is a very world-renowned endurance race that takes place at like 10,000 feet of elevation on average in Leadville, Colorado, he won it, and he also set the course record that no one really ever thought was going to get broken. And he broke it by 16 minutes. And he ran 70 to 75 miles a week in his prep. So if that doesn't show you that mileage is not everything, I don't know what will. He did some cross training for sure, but also he's older and he knows his body, and he knows that if he pushes super high mileage, it's going to break him down. He's not going to be available to run well on race day. So everyone he beat in that, probably everyone who's ever won the Leadville 100 is and or was absolutely up well above 100 miles per week. And boom, David Roche walks onto the scene and crushes it this year. And he continues to keep that mileage, what would be considered moderate in the ultra endurance space. So although some people can benefit and handle higher run volume, and one of the first levers that is a good idea for them to pull is adding mileage, that's not the case for everyone. Some individuals can't really handle all that much mileage, or that maybe they can handle it, but it doesn't really benefit them any extra than just making their quality runs a little bit higher quality and focusing on other aspects of run programming. So anytime you hear just crank your mileage, give it at least a second thought and think maybe there's another lever I can pull or something else I can consider in my run training. But maybe that mileage increase is beneficial. If you're a lower mileage and you're struggling with your 5 mile or your 10K, maybe adding another 30 to 60 minute easy run throughout the week may be all you need. Other times, maybe you're doing too much mileage and you need to dial back the mileage in order to get better because you just can't recover, and or you're running yourself into the ground, potentially putting yourself at risk for injury. So mileage is not everything, and that wraps it up. That's the last myth. Thank you guys very much for tuning in. I'll be back soon with another video. Till then, Terminator out.